Today's devotional is entitled Esther, a Woman of Destiny. It's the third devotional in our series of devotionals for women, and our key verse is Esther 4:14. It says in part, "And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" We recently talked about Deborah and Abigail, so today we'll turn our attention to Esther. And just as Deborah and Abigail found themselves in difficult and uncomfortable places, so too did Esther. So let's turn in our Bibles to the book of Esther and let the word speak for itself once again. But before we begin to read about Esther, let's walk through what's already taken place prior to Esther's entrance into this Bible account. Now, the events in the book of Esther took place sometime between the first and the second return of some of the Jews from their 70-year Babylonian captivity. A Persian king with the Persian title of Ahasuerus and the Greek name Xerxes was reigning during the time that this historical account unfolded. And we learn from Esther 2:6 that a number of Jews had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. And in that group of exiles, we find Mordecai and his younger cousin Esther. And then we learn from Esther 2:7 that Esther's parents were no longer living. So Mordecai had taken Esther and was raising her as his own daughter. In Esther chapter 1, this king Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, had instituted a huge pagan feast with a lot of eating and drinking, and then in a drunken state, King Xerxes called for Queen Vashti to come and to stand before the king and the men at the feast. The Bible tells us that Queen Vashti was very beautiful and fair to look upon, but Vashti refused to come. And the king was very angry, and he was counseled by his wise men and his princes to banish Vashti from the kingdom. Then in chapter 2, the king regrets his decision. The king's attendants suggest that young virgins be brought to the king so that he could choose one that he pleased and make her queen in Vashti's place. Esther was a young, beautiful girl and was brought to be a part of this beauty contest, if you will. And as we'll see, God's hand was on her life, though she had already faced many, many hard things in her thus far short life. But she found favor in the sight of the king's servant who had charge over the women. And as most of us know, Esther also found favor in the eyes of the king, and she did become the new queen in Vashti's place. Also in chapter 2, another significant event takes place. After Esther had been made queen, Mordecai saves the king's life. Two of the king's officials, the very ones who guarded the door, ironically, his door, they had conspired to assassinate the king. And Mordecai overheard, and he sent a word to the king through Esther. The plot was investigated, found to be true, and the two men were hanged. Then the event was recorded in the Chronicles in the king's presence. So we get to chapter 3, and we find the wicked man named Haman, who was also a servant of the king. Now King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, and he gave him authority over the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants at the king's gate would bow down to Haman, and they would give him honor. Well, all but one, that is. Mordecai the Jew would not. And you know, power can corrupt. And apparently Haman got really prideful when almost everyone around him bowed down to him. And then he got really angry when Mordecai refused to bow. So he came up with a plot to get rid of Mordecai, but also to get rid of all the Jews. Now, at this point, Esther had not as yet revealed that she was Jewish. So Haman had no idea that he was actually plotting against the queen. Then in chapter 4, Mordecai finds out about Haman's wicked plot. Mordecai then goes and he sits at the king's gate in sackcloth and ashes. Esther hears of this and sends Hatach from the king's eunuchs to find out what was wrong with Mordecai. And it's here in the Bible account that we're going to pick up reading in Esther chapter 4. So let's start here with verse 5. Then Esther called for Hatach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hatach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. Also, he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. And Hatach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. And Esther spake unto Hatach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. She said, All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his, to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. And so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way, and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Now, let's go ahead and move into Esther chapter 5, beginning with verse 1. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel, and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? It shall be given thee to the half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day into the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Then answered Esther and said, My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. Now, the remainder of chapter 5 talks about how Haman plans to hang Mordecai, and at his wife's suggestion, he builds huge gallows on which to do so. Then in chapter 6, we find that the king cannot sleep, and he has someone read to him from the book of Chronicles, and then he's reminded of how Mordecai saved his life. So he decides to honor Mordecai. So the king asks Haman for a suggestion on how to honor someone who deserves great honor. Well, Haman pridefully assumes that the king is probably referring to him. So he proceeds to tell the king how one should be honored. The king likes the suggestion, and then he tells Haman to go and honor Mordecai exactly in the way he has described. And Haman is humiliated and angry and stunned but he has no choice but to obey. So he does, and then he hurries home humiliated. He begins to tell his wife all that has happened. But while they're still talking, the king's eunuchs come and hurry him away to the second banquet with Esther and the king. Now, all this sounds a little ironic until you realize the incredible sovereignty of God at work in this situation and all through the book of Esther. So let's go on into chapter 7 and continue our Bible account of Esther. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, Will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbonah, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king. They standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. So Esther was a young girl who could have wallowed in an orphan spirit and a wounded heart full of self-pity, because life had cheated her of her own parents, and she'd been raised by her older cousin, Mordecai, who was like a father to her. The Bible tells us that he took her as his own daughter. But Esther could have continued in that self-pity and protested that she did not want to participate in a beauty contest that she did not choose, or spend her life married to a wicked king of a heathen nation if she won the beauty contest. Maybe she had no choice but to go to the palace, but apparently instead of bitterness in her heart, there was a beauty from the inside out. She found favor in that heathen king's eyes and was chosen as his next bride. It probably was not the wedding and the marriage that she had dreamed of and envisioned. And she could have thought, Lord, I did not get to grow up with my own parents, and now I have to have a heathen husband as well. Where is my comfort, Lord? Where is the life I should have gotten? But somehow these were not Esther's thoughts, or if they were, she overcame them and surrendered these questions with no answers to the Lord. When the God-ordained purpose of her marriage to this heathen king was revealed, Esther listened to Mordecai as he instructed her, telling her that what was before her was a God-given destiny for such a time as this. Mordecai explained to Esther that if she did not step up into this brave and courageous role, that God would raise up another to fill the destiny of deliverance for his people. God-given destinies, it does not always come in the packages we expect. Choices are set before us, but God will not force us to walk in our destinies. He gives us a free will. And free will must exist for genuine love to exist. However, if we refuse to step into what God has put before us, He will raise up another, and we will miss the privilege of partnering with Him, partnering with God to fulfill our destinies and to bring about His will on earth as it is in heaven. I just imagine in fear and trembling, Esther said yes. She, along with others, fasted and prayed for 3 full days before making known her request to the king. In her delicate beauty, we must ask if there was a trembling to her hand as she stepped forward before the king to request entrance into his presence. Was her mouth dry as she swallowed hard, waiting to see if he would hold out the golden scepter? Was her heart beating so loudly that she could barely hear her own quiet request for the king to attend her banquet the following day? Esther's ordeal spanned days of wording and rewording what she would need to say. Maybe sleep fled away at night as she lay pondering the next day and the next. But fear did not win. She stepped boldly into the presence of the king and laid out her concern in quiet, clear, concise, and well-articulated speech when the time finally arrived for her business before the king to be made known. Esther is characterized by courage, even if that courage might have cost her her own life. And she didn't know ahead of time how things would turn out. She did right because it was right, even in the face of fear. She did what was best for her people at the expense of her own comfort and her own perceived security. But in this choice to do right, at the risk of losing her life, she gained real security. For her security came only as she was willing to become vulnerable and put the security of others ahead of her own. So what does this mean for us as women of courage, women of wisdom, women of destiny? Stepping into destiny requires courage. Stepping into destiny requires doing right because it's right, even in the face of fear. Stepping into destiny means doing what is best for those we're responsible for, even at the expense of our own comfort and our own perceived security. Therefore, real security comes from choosing to do right, being willing to become vulnerable, and putting the security of others, the others that we are responsible for, ahead of our own when necessary. So may we rise up like Deborah, like Abigail, and like Esther in wisdom into our God-given destinies. May we rise up in gracious peacemaking and in bold courage in the face of fear and insecurity, no matter what our personal circumstances might be. Let us rise up, empowered by God's Spirit, even if our hearts are beating wildly in our chest and our emotions are rolling in turmoil around the choices we are called to make. Let us stand for what is right without looking back at the fear riding close on our heels. For as we step forward into places of courage, we will find out that fear cannot continue to follow. Let's pray. Lord, will you strengthen us by your Spirit to stand in courage, wisdom, and purpose as we step fully into our God-given destinies. Let us not be deceived by the lies of the enemy that tell us we have to live second-best lives because of our previous choices or because of life's circumstances that were beyond our control. Show us the full truth of your sovereignty and your foreknowledge. Remind us that you knew ahead of time every choice we would ever make. You wove even our mistakes into the fullness of the destiny for which you created us. Nothing will separate us from your love and your purposes when we come to you fully surrendered and fully repentant. Life's circumstances do not tilt the scales away from our favor when we are on your side and you are on our side. Give us visions of the destinies we were each created for, and cause us to step into those destinies, even if our hearts are beating wildly in our chest. We trust We trust you, Lord, and we look to you, Lord. We pray all these things in your name. Amen.